Welcome to What to Expect at the Delegate Assembly. I am Joanne Gallardo. I'm Conference Co-Minister for Indiana, Michigan Mennonite Conference. To start out our evening, I invite you to join me in a word of prayer. God of discernment and wisdom, we thank you for your Spirit's guidance in calling out leaders for the church that you love. Be with us this evening as we seek to prepare folks new to our church structures and processes. Help us to remember to leave room for your voice to speak, to hear one another, and together work at the task you have set before us. Amen. This is the first of two MCUSA webinars to help delegates prepare for the upcoming Delegate Assembly. In today's webinar, we will look at highlights from the agenda. We'll discuss the role of delegates and talk about discernment. We will not be addressing questions related to the proposed resolutions, as that will be the topic of the second webinar, which will be on June 15th. Tonight's gathering, as you may have noticed, is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting links to resources in the chat, including a link to MCUSA's delegates resource page where you can find more information, including the agenda, an FAQ, the proposed resolutions, and bylaw changes, and a link to our first webinar. We welcome your questions and we will try to get to as many as we can. Feel free to use the Q&A feature in the menu bar of your Zoom screen. If you need Spanish interpretation, please click the globe icon in the Zoom menu bar. Bienvenido. En los controles de seminario web, haga clic en interpretación. Haga clic en el idioma que desea escuchar. Tonight, I am joined by Iris de Leon Hartshorn, Associate Executive Director of Operations for Mennonite Church USA, and Phil Niss, Senior Pastor at Parkview Mennonite Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. My first question for Iris is, Iris, can you tell us a little bit about the Delegate Assembly? You're muted.
No wonder I was doing so well. The Delegate Assembly is going to be held on July 7th and 8th, which is a Friday and Saturday, immediately after MenoCon in Kansas City, Missouri. And the theme will be part of our journey forward, our renewed commitments, which are to follow Jesus, witness to God's peace, and transformed by the Holy Spirit. And so this convention, we're going to focus on transformed by the Holy Spirit.
So Iris, why is the 2023 Delegate Assembly after MenoCon instead of during the convention?
Well, throughout the years, we have gotten feedback from delegates that felt they always had to pick between being part of the delegate session and missing out things during the convention. And we've gone back and forth as staff as to what best way to remedy that. So this year, we're going to do it after convention so that delegates no longer have to miss anything from MenoCon to participate in the Delegate Assembly.
And some delegates on this call may be wondering who can serve as a delegate.
Well, as you know, we have bylaws, and in our bylaws, each congregation is eligible to send one delegate per 100 member of their congregation or a fraction of. So let's say you have 160, you can send 2 delegates. Also, congregations have the option to invite an additional delegate and bring a youth delegate, ages 16 to 21. And I really encourage that congregations do that so that we have future young upcoming leaders and they get the experience. Each conference of Mennonite Church USA is eligible to send one delegate per 1,000 area conference members or a fraction of. Also, conferences can send up to 2 youth delegates. Again, and then each racial, ethnic group that has been officially recognized by the executive board may send 3 delegates plus 1 delegate per every 1,000 members of such recognized group. And they have the option to also send 2 additional youth delegates, again, ages 16 to 21. In addition to that, each member of the executive board is automatically a delegate.
Iris, are pastors automatically delegates?
Pastors are not automatically delegates. Each congregation chooses who they send. So it could be their pastor, but each congregation decides who they send, if they send their pastor or not, or any other member of their congregation. So being a pastor is not a requirement in our bylaws and is not an automatic delegate.
Do churches need to send the same delegates as they had in 2021 and 2022?
No, delegates do not have to be the same people that delegates were sent to previous delegate sessions.
And so can non-delegates attend the delegate assembly?
Non-delegates may attend. We will have gallery seating for them. And the registration system includes an option for non-delegate registration. So when you register, you can put on there that you also want to register for the delegate sessions. But we just remember that non-delegates cannot be seated at the tables with the delegates. They cannot have a voice in going up or voting, but they can observe what's going on in delegate session in the gallery.
So we know we have business meetings, but can you give us some highlights about the worship at delegate assembly?
Yeah, and I guess that's the most, we do have business attend, but I always enjoy the worship and the Bible study that we always have at delegate session. So I'm really happy to announce that our Bible teacher this year is going to be Dr. Sarah Ann Bixler, and she's the assistant professor of formation and practical theology and the associate dean of Eastern Mennonite Seminary in Virginia. And we're going to have 3 Bible study sessions with Sarah. The first one will be a short introductory into the text that she will be using, and the next 2 will be more lengthy, and there'll be table discussion around the scriptures and her teaching. For the worship part, I'm really excited because we're going to have Say Jin and Lane Miller come. Say Jin studied art, religion, music at Goshen College, and she served as the visual and worship artist in many Anabaptist settings, and has worked as a member of the Mennonite Worship and Song Committee that produced Voices Together, the songbook for the North American Mennonite Church. Her husband, Lane Miller, graduated from AMBS with an MDiv in theology, and he has taught workshops on worship and music across the Midwest. He's also led worship for AMBS Pastors Week Convention and served as a pastor of worship and formation at Kern Mennonite Church.
So we have business meetings, we have worship. What else can people coming look forward to?
Well, this year I've strongly encouraged our agencies and other groups when they report to do storytelling, because this is about transformation. And I think the church wants to hear how people have been transformed in their lives through the different agencies or different things that we've done as part of NCUSA. So this year, well, the last couple of years, we've been sending money, grants for our peace and justice grants. And we are going to have 2 stories from 2 recipients about the inspiring work that they've been doing. Now, the justice funds for MCUSA congregations are working around issues like poverty, racism, addressing immigration reform, or reimagining policing. So this year, we're going to hear from Koinonia Indian Mennonite Church and Boulder Mennonite Church. They were both awarded peace and justice grants, and they'll be sharing how they use the money to team up with people in their own community around peace and justice work. And then our other 5 agencies will showcase their work and ministry and how it's been transformative to the constituency. We also have a project that we've been working with the Canadian Church, is the Accountability and Prevention Project. So the team has been working to create a centralized, comprehensive guidebook for regional churches and conferences and congregations that addresses prevention of abuse by lay and credentialed leaders, as well as leadership accountability. So Michael will be speaking to that just to get some general feedback, because this is a long-term project they're still working on. We also want you to know that there'll be Spanish translation at delegate session. We want you to know that also there'll be material for delegate session resources will also be in Spanish, that will also be online. So all the reports from all the agencies, all the business, all that will be both in English and Spanish.
Will delegates, Iris, be voting on any resolutions?
There are no state resolutions this year. However, delegates will be asked to vote on 3 organizational resolutions from the executive board on a number of board appointments and appointees. And that's something we do every year or every delegate session. These are people that serve on boards church-wide. But in addition to that, there will be some resolutions. The first one that they're proposing is to lengthen the delegate cycle from 2 years to 3 years. And of course, this has probably been a debate for maybe the last 10, 15 years on, do we do 2 years? Do we do 3 years? But part of the reason is that a 2-year cycle doesn't allow the staff and other people, when we pass a resolution, it takes a while to get it implemented and get it into the church. And 2 years isn't enough, because right after convention, then you might have a year to just start to work on it, and then the next convention comes up. We also heard from youth pastors that had preferred that we not do it every 2 years, because the youth seem to like fundraise, come to convention, and then start fundraising again for the next convention. And this will give youth to do other things like swap or with VS or some other kind of ministry and service projects. The second proposal is to revise the bylaws to clarify program entities. If you remember, the Mennonite was considered an entity, a part of NCUSA, not an agency. And part of, so there will be a shift with Everence and MHS Association from being program agencies to ministry partners or entities. If the feedback is positive, delegates will be asked to vote to provide approval to make the necessary revisions in our bylaws that reflect the new status of the organizations. And we'll be doing another webinar on June 15th that will focus on the proposed resolutions. At the delegate assembly, we're also planning for significant time for table discussion and discernment. And there will be a panel discussion just on this question about changing from agencies to entities.
What is the best way for delegates to prepare for the assembly?
Well, I think webinars are a great introduction to what's going to be happening. But I think the biggest thing is to be sure to read the information on the delegate resource page. And there'll be a link in the chat where that is, and the information again, both in English and Spanish. And why it's so important to read before you come and be prepared is that when I was a delegate many, many years ago, one of the frustrating things is that you have people that come prepared and ready for some discussion, and some people that hadn't even read the material. So you spend a lot of time catching your table mates with up the information before you can have the conversation, and that really cuts the time that you have to have for discernment and conversations at your table. So I think it's being respectful to be prepared and read the materials before coming. Also, we ask for prayer and fasting for Mennonite Church USA, our community of faith. But we also ask that you do it as an individual before coming, to be prepared and to have your hearts open. Joanne, a question for you, since you've asked me so many.
I have.
What have you found helpful as a delegate? And how do you help your congregations prepare for delegate assembly?
I have been a delegate all times, but maybe two between 2003 and now. So that's almost my entire time in the Mennonite Church. And so I can't get enough, apparently, of delegate assemblies. So I found that starting off in a posture of prayer and discernment, like you mentioned, Iris, is important. And sometimes it's difficult to figure out, am I voting for me, or am I voting for what my congregation would vote if they were here? And it's a difficult question. And the way I have moved forward with that, it's a bit of both, and it's a lot of asking for the Spirit's guidance. And to do that, a lot of this ties to what you said, Iris. You need to read the material beforehand. You need to know what you're coming into. I know it can seem like a lot of material. You don't need to memorize the material, every last detail. It's okay to have a speed read through it, but you should come away knowing, have a really good sense of what is being proposed, and also be prepared to make a decision about it. As for congregations, from what I hear from our Indiana, Michigan congregations, communication from leadership, be that pastors or some churches have lay leaders, is key because people want to be in the know. And you're going to have people in your congregations, as I've experienced, divided over wanting to know every little detail of what happens, and people who just want a general overview of what happened. So if you're going to the delegate assembly, be prepared for church members to ask you questions. People may not be as interested in this as you are, but you still have a responsibility to your congregation to let them know, I went to the delegate assembly, we did the business of the church, and here it was. And looking back at my experience as a delegate, I wish the first time I had gone in learning a bit more about parliamentary procedure. So I started when I was a youth delegate, and this was something I hadn't experienced before. I didn't quite know what was happening. And so you don't have to do a deep dive into what parliamentary procedure is, but maybe learning some terms and learning how business meetings sort of are run will help you be more in the know. And now I have a question for Phil. What have you found helpful as a delegate? And have you represented your congregation as a delegate? And one more question, how do you engage your congregation prior to the delegate assembly?
Thanks, Joanne, and thanks everyone else who's joined us this evening too. It's good to be with you. I'm of course a pastor at Parkview Mennonite, but also a delegate, and I've been a delegate for every delegate assembly that there's been since I've been in that role. Our congregation, because of our size, we are allotted four delegate positions. So the congregation has always sent two of the pastors, believing that the pastors are better equipped if they are engaged with the broader church and they value our presence there as delegates, but then also two other lay leaders in the congregation that we switch around each assembly. So as a pastor and delegate, I found my role to be meaningful. I've really enjoyed engaging with the broader church. In terms of preparing myself and the other delegates and the congregation, one of the things we always try to do at Parkview is to have a meeting of the four delegates together ahead of time to talk more at length about what's in the agenda and what's going to be in the docket, what we should be familiarizing ourselves with. And some of these delegates might be newer to the church-wide conversation, so we might need to do a little bit of bringing them up to speed on some issues. So that's always helpful. Also, if the delegate assembly is processing any particularly weighty issues, like we were at the special delegate session last year and some years ago as well, then we provide an opportunity for the whole congregation to share and talk and ask questions before the assembly if need be. We often do that in kind of roundtable conversation groups. We somewhat mimicking the process that we use at delegate assembly itself to talk at tables. The other thing, as far as informing the congregation, I'm going to share my screen for just a moment here to show you the letter that we sent to the congregation just prior to the special assembly. This is something that I think any church that uses email to communicate regularly with their congregation could do something along this line. So we've just a letter to inform our congregation who would be representing Parkview at the delegate session, the four people who are going, and to ask them to hold them in prayer. And also feel free to reach out to them with any questions or words of encouragement. Just a review of how those persons were chosen and what their role is. And then we presented the delegate agenda in as concise a way as we could. We'd rather not just depend on people who are curious to go to the MCUSA website and find it for themselves, but to put it down in a fairly simple, well-organized way that they can see really what we're looking at the session, and then providing all the links they need that are important all in one place. So for the special session, we had a link in this email that we sent to the whole congregation to the full text of all four resolutions that were on tap, as well as the impact statements that were prepared. We linked them to the schedule and agenda and to other delegate resources, to Glenn's blog. And then we also linked them to prior training webinars that were intended for the delegates, but also would be informative for anyone. So this really is a quick way to get information out there, and people can choose based on their level of interest. As Joanne said, you know, some people are deeply interested in this and want to do a deep dive and find out what are the details, and others maybe are vaguely interested, and some are really, it's not even on their radar unless we put it there in front of them. And so this is a way to put it in front of them and give them easy access to what's being done there. And we also, because MCUSA prepared a nice video, we put a link to that video in the email as well. So just an idea of a method of sharing information with the congregation that I wanted to pass on. And then after the assembly, reporting back, it's important to let the congregation know what we talked about and what was decided. We usually devote an entire Sunday morning worship service to a reporting back. Now that includes the youth convention and the Menocon adult convention, as well as the delegate assembly. So that's all wrapped up in one morning service. And we think that's an important time to get for the youth to have their own voice and to share what was meaningful to them, or what was maybe frustrating, or what was challenging, or what was eye-opening for them. They often have something to share with the congregation of that nature. We get to sing some of the songs that were maybe introduced in worship, give a summary of some of the messages that they heard, and that kind of thing. And then the delegates have an opportunity just to share briefly in 1 or 2 minutes what was their takeaway from the delegate assembly. How did they feel? What did they hear? What are their thoughts and feelings about the church as a whole? And so that's been a good thing to do. After the May special session, because that one did not involve a Menocon attached to it, we actually had a Sunday evening time for people who wanted to hear more from our delegates to come and hear from them directly. So we had a good hour and a half conversation with our delegates after the special session. So that was very helpful.
I spoke a little about this, but Phil, I know that sometimes first-time delegates have questions about how they should discern at the delegate assembly. For example, should a delegate vote with their conscience or vote to represent their congregation? So what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I actually have pretty strong feelings about this. And I know it may not be the same perspective that some other pastors or churches are used to, but I have always felt strongly that in MCUSA, congregations send persons. They don't send votes. And that's an important distinction. And I realize there are congregations who don't look at that way particularly, and make some effort to send a delegation that represents exactly what the congregation has decided they want to support or not support, and in the proper proportion to represent the congregation accurately. But I think that really undermines the purpose of the delegate assembly, which is to gather and do discernment together. And I think MCUSA has taken it very seriously that the gathering is for the purpose of doing discernment. So what I tell the congregation is we've selected delegates on the basis of because we trust them, and we trust them to be discerning and wise people who reflect, in general, the values and commitments of our congregation. That's why we chose them as delegates. If they were only carrying our vote to assembly, that's really not putting much trust in them, or it's really diminishing their role. I mean, a carrier pigeon can carry votes too, or we can send them by email or letter, or there's not much benefit to sending people to carry a vote if that's all they're carrying. We send them to do discernment. And so we want them to vote their conscience with an awareness of the body who sent them. So we don't instruct them how to cast their vote. And we also don't ask them to go back to the congregation and report their specific vote on every resolution. We report the outcome. But once they get to the location of the assembly, then they are part of a larger body. They're not there as individuals or congregations. They are there as part of a larger body, and that body together is doing the deciding. And then we can report back what was decided. But that's kind of how we've gone about it. I think it's a expression of trust in our delegates to give them that freedom. And it's important for me as a pastor too, to articulate that to the congregation, to remind them that that's what the delegates are there to do, so that there's not an unrealistic expectation of what they're doing there, or it's not necessary for the congregation to vote on all the resolutions ahead of time and decide what we think, because that's going to be discussed there. So that, yeah, I think that pretty much covers how what I feel about that.
Thank you for that. And that's a good segue into our next question, because as Anabaptists, we believe in making decisions in community, and it's not always easy. How can we help create a good environment for our discussions? This is an open question to anyone.
I'll just say one of the things that we try to do, and I don't know if Crystal can upload this, but we do provide some guidance at the tables about group discussions and how people should treat each other with respect, how to be a good listener. And I think, part of it is, for me, is just really coming with an open heart. And that's really hard sometimes when we have such strong beliefs about something. I have a strong personality, so I always have to work really hard at it. So for me, I have to do a lot of preparatory work before I get there. And then I have to just keep mindful of some guidelines about listening, being open, and taking the role of being a listener rather than always having to give my opinion. So I'm just saying, personally, that's how I've worked at it.
Yeah, a communal discernment is hard to do as a community when you're a body of 300 or 400 people sitting in a room, and there's 2 or 3 mics, and there's business to be done according to Robert's Rules of Orders and so on. But that's why I've really appreciated the opportunity we've had the last number of assemblies to gather in smaller communities and have those table groups become a community, work at learning to know who they are, where they're coming from, what's sort of the needs and joys of their respective communities that they are coming from, and their context of ministry and all of that, so that when we then start sharing our thoughts and beliefs and feelings, we have a context to understand where they're coming from. And I think that's so important for our delegate assemblies, especially when we're working with people who we don't know as well, or maybe have met only a time or two. But it's also important in the local congregation. And I don't think any congregation, even a small congregation, should be above the need to even break it down into smaller groups. So when we've had a congregational meeting and divided the folks up into groups of 5 or 6, the quality of interaction and discernment that can happen in that kind of setting is so much greater, and it keeps certain voices from dominating and gives everyone a chance to contribute to the corporate discernment.
And I would just add to that, I too, like Iris, have a rather strong personality. And so what has helped me when getting into any sort of discussion, debate over whatever business the church is doing is to approach with an attitude of curiosity and a willingness to ask the question to say more. Many times when we disagree, we kind of shut that part off of our brain that's curious and wants to know more about people. If by leaving yourself open to curiosity, I believe we can start to connect with one another and understand where another person is coming from. And also being aware, and this was already alluded to, who is taking up space and who has not taken up space in the table conversations. Maybe it's you who says we haven't heard from somebody, or maybe it's you who says let's hear from someone else or speak yourself. Sometimes it takes a bit of initiative to help things go smoothly. I'm guessing there's a question for me.
I will ask it. Joanne, I understand that you have a number of youth delegates. Oh, I understand we have a number of youth delegates registered. And I'd like to talk about how we can best support youth delegates as fellow delegates or congregational members.
So when I went as a youth delegate, I remember being very intimidated because I had just entered college. So I was 18 or so back in 2003, and that was considered youth, like we talked about, to age 21. And I hadn't been Mennonite for very long, so I asked my pastor to explain to me all the details of what happened in 2001 with the denominational merger. And I still didn't get it after that. I'm not sure I get it now, but I get it enough, and that's what's important. So if there are some things you're learning and don't quite get, it is okay to ask. It is always okay to ask questions. And this has happened to me a couple times at a table. It is also very possible that this won't be your experience at all. And this happens in any group of people you're with. There are some people who are very convinced of their own importance, and maybe people should know who they are. They make that assumption. I had an embarrassing moment at a table one time, not knowing a president of a seminary, and some others acted astonished that I didn't know who they were. He was very gracious. Some people at the table were not. You don't need to know who everyone is. You don't need to know how to play the Mennonite game. It's okay because everyone at your table gets the same vote. No one's more important than another person. We are all on an equal playing field there. Some people do have more power than others, but what makes this a good assembly is that we each get a vote. No vote has more weight than another. There'll also be people walking around and available to ask questions to. And you don't have to feel shy in raising your hand. Someone can come to your table and explain what's happening if something is confusing to you. There also may be people at your table who've been a delegate quite a number of times and who've done this before and can help you. And so I encourage youth to voice the things they need at their table, to voice the things they may feel uncomfortable with, and not be afraid to ask questions. And if you disagree on a particular subject, encourage the youth around you, if you're not a youth delegate, to give their thoughts and opinions and any alternative views that should be put on the table. So I would really appreciate if those of us who are a bit older delegates leave some extra space and some extra time and attention for our youth delegates, because this is a big deal. Doing the work of the church is a big deal, and it can be really scary when it's your first time. So even though it's your first time, connect with another person who may be younger and it's their first time. That's my advice. And I have a question for Phil.
Well, can I just tap onto that same
Oh, of
question?
course you can. Yes.
One thing about involving youth is that we should think about the long game here and not just getting our youth to sit at a table at delegate assembly. It's are we preparing them throughout their lives for engagement in the church and of having a voice at the table of decision making in the congregation? And so if we're doing that, it's a much easier shift to then engage the broader church. But if they don't have a seat at the table in our own congregation, they're going to be ill prepared to have a seat at the table in the denomination. So I think we have to nurture this over the long haul. That's just another broader comment about it.
Iris, do you have any thoughts or reflections for that question?
No, I just think that when the church decided to add this, the youth delegates, I think it was a smart move because those are the leaders of the, and I'm not going to say the future, they're the leaders of the church now even. They're developing into who will be leading the church very soon. And so whatever we can do to prepare the next generation to lead the church, we need to do what we can. And so if you're a delegate at a table, like Joanne said, take some time to get to know the youth delegate, be open to them if they have questions, and yeah, provide some kind of environment where they feel some sense of safety.